A 6-year-old girl stood at a hospital reception counter, her feet barely reaching the floor from the tall metal stool she'd climbed onto. In her tiny brown hands, she held 7 crumpled dollar bills and a small pile of coins. 53 cents, to be exact. She had counted them 3 times on the bus ride over. 3 times because she wanted to be sure. Because she knew, even at 6 years old, that being sure was the only thing standing between her grandmother and being turned away. Her name was Kiara, and behind her, sitting quietly in a wheelchair the hospital had loaned them at the entrance, was her grandmother, Mabel. A woman who had survived a hurricane in Haiti, survived a boat ride across an ocean, survived 31 years of scrubbing other people's floors in a country that never once learned to pronounce her name correctly. Mabel didn't speak English. Not really. She knew thank you and God bless and please, and she used all 3 often. But the words on the medical forms in front of them might as well have been written in fire. So Kiara read them. Kiara translated them. Kiara, 6 years old, in a pink sweater 2 sizes too small, was the reason her grandmother could see a doctor at all. The receptionist, a woman named Brenda, watched the little girl count her money for the 4th time. The bill was $247. Kiara had $7.53. She looked up at Brenda with eyes too old for her face and said, in a voice so small it almost disappeared into the fluorescent hum of the waiting room, "Is it okay if I bring the rest next week? I promise. I always keep my promises." What Kiara did not know, could not have known, was that across the waiting room, a man in a charcoal gray suit had stopped scrolling on his phone. He had stopped breathing, almost. He was watching her the way a person watches someone carrying something too heavy across a very long room, wondering when they will finally fall. His name was Oliver Kensington. He owned 3 companies, 4 homes, and a foundation with his name on the door. And he had come to this hospital that morning for a routine cardiology follow-up, expecting to be in and out in an hour. He had not expected to see a 6-year-old holding an entire family together with $7.53. He had not expected the ground to shift beneath his polished Italian shoes. But it did. And in the 60 seconds that followed, everything about that little girl's life, and his own, was about to change forever. Let me take you back. Back to the beginning of that Tuesday morning. Before the hospital. Before the $7. Before Oliver Kensington ever laid eyes on Kiara. The apartment was small. 2 rooms if you counted the kitchen, which you probably shouldn't, because the kitchen was really just a stove pushed against a wall and a refrigerator that hummed too loudly at night. It was on the 3rd floor of a building in a neighborhood where the sirens never really stopped. They just took turns. Kiara shared the bedroom with her grandmother. There was 1 bed, and Kiara slept on the couch in the living room, curled up under a blanket her mother had crocheted before she died. Her mother. Kiara didn't remember her. Not really. She had been 2 years old when it happened. But there was a photograph on the wall. A woman in a nurse's uniform, smiling, 1 hand on her hip, the other holding a small child. That child was Kiara, and the woman was Amara, Kiara's mother. A nurse, a daughter, a widow. And at the age of 28, dead of a condition that could have been treated if she had been able to afford treatment. If she had been able to take a day off work. If she had been the kind of person the system was built to catch. Mabel had raised Kiara alone since then, on Social Security checks, on the kindness of a church 3 blocks away that sometimes left grocery bags at their door, on the sheer force of a grandmother's love, which is a currency that pays for many things, but not, unfortunately, for medical bills. That Tuesday morning, Mabel had woken up short of breath. Again. It had been happening more often. The tightness in her chest, the fatigue that made her sit down halfway across a room. Kiara had noticed. Kiara noticed everything. She had crawled off the couch at 5:30 in the morning, pulled a chair up to the kitchen counter, and made her grandmother a cup of tea the way Mabel had taught her. Hot water, 1 bag of chamomile, a spoonful of honey from the jar the church had brought. "Grandma?" Kiara had said, holding the mug up with both hands like it was a chalice. "We need to go to the doctor today." Mabel had shaken her head. In Creole, she had said, "Non, mon petit chou, nous pas gain l'argent." "No, my little cabbage, we have no money." But Kiara, who had learned Creole before she learned English, had shaken her head right back. "Grandma, I have money. I saved it." From the coins in the couch and the $2 Ms. Jefferson gave me for helping her carry her groceries. "I have $7.53. That's a lot. We can go." Mabel had looked at her granddaughter for a long moment, and then she had done what she had done 1,000 times before, ever since Kiara was 4 years old and reading medical forms out loud at the pharmacy counter. She had nodded. Because when a 6-year-old is the only bridge between you and the rest of the world, you learn to trust the bridge, even when you know she should not have to carry the weight. They took 2 buses to the hospital. Kiara held the tickets. Kiara asked the driver which stop was theirs. Kiara helped her grandmother down the steps at the transfer point, watching her carefully, one small hand on her elbow. And when they finally arrived at the hospital, a big glass building with a revolving door that Kiara had always been a little afraid of, Kiara was the one who walked up to the reception desk, climbed onto the stool, and said, in her clearest, most grown-up voice, "Good morning. My grandmother needs to see a doctor. Her chest hurts." That was where Oliver Kensington first saw her. Not counting money. Not yet. Just standing on a stool, translating her grandmother's illness into a language a system could understand. Oliver had been sitting in the waiting room for 20 minutes when Kiara walked in. He had a folder in his lap containing his latest cardiac imaging. His own doctor had told him, 3 months earlier, that if he did not slow down, if he did not stop working 18-hour days and eating dinner out of takeout containers at midnight, his heart was going to give him a very expensive lesson. So here he was, slowing down. Sort of. His phone was still in his hand, and he was still answering emails, and his assistant David was texting him about a merger call at 11. But then Kiara had walked in, holding her grandmother's hand, and something about the two of them had made Oliver's thumb stop moving over the screen. It was the way Kiara walked, not like a child, like a small, serious adult, like someone who had been given a job to do and was determined to do it well. She led her grandmother to a chair, helped her sit down, and then adjusted the older woman's coat around her shoulders the way a mother tucks in a baby. Then she took a clipboard from the reception desk, sat down beside her grandmother, and began, with a pencil that was too big for her hand, to fill out the paperwork. Oliver had watched, at first only casually. But the longer he watched, the more he noticed. The way Kiara sounded out each word on the form under her breath. The way she stopped, occasionally, to whisper a question to her grandmother in a language Oliver didn't recognize. The way Mabel would answer softly, and Kiara would nod and then write something down. Insurance number, none. Emergency contact, Mrs. Alma Jefferson, apartment 3B. Reason for visit. My grandma's chest hurts when she breathes. Oliver felt something turn over in his stomach. Somewhere in the last 2 decades of building companies and closing deals, he had forgotten that this happened. That children, actual children did this. Not as a story on the news, not as a statistic in a foundation report. Right here, 6 feet away from him, on a Tuesday morning. A nurse came out and called their name. Kiara stood up, took her grandmother's hand, and walked her down the hallway. Oliver watched the door close behind them. And then he did something he did not usually do. He stayed. Even after his own name was called. Even after his own appointment ended 40 minutes later. He stayed. Because he wanted to see how the story ended. Because some part of him, the part he had buried under a decade of quarterly reports and board meetings, knew, somehow, that this was not a story he was allowed to walk away from. Inside the exam room, Kiara stood on her tiptoes beside the exam table where her grandmother sat. Dr. Patel, a kind woman with tired eyes and a stethoscope hanging around her neck, was asking questions. And Kiara was translating. Every word. Chest pain. When did it start? How often? Does it radiate to the left arm? Does she have a history of high blood pressure? Is she on any medications? Does she have insurance? Does anyone in the family have a history of heart disease? Kiara translated all of it. Sometimes she had to ask Dr. Patel what a word meant. Radiate, history, medication. And Dr. Patel, to her credit, would kneel down to Kiara's eye level and explain, patiently, using smaller words. But Dr. Patel was also frowning. Not at Kiara, at the situation. Because Dr. Patel knew, as every doctor in that hospital knew, that the hospital was legally required to provide interpreter services for patients who did not speak English. There was a phone in every exam room, a button you pressed, a voice on the other end who spoke Creole, or Spanish, or Mandarin, or Vietnamese, or any of 40 other languages. It was federal law. It was hospital policy. It was, by every measure, the right thing to do. But nobody had offered. Nobody at the front desk had asked. Nobody had said, "Ma'am, we have interpreters. Would you like one?" They had simply handed the clipboard to the 6-year-old because the 6-year-old spoke English, and it was easier that way. Easier for them. Not easier for Kiara. But nobody had asked Kiara. Dr. Patel finished the exam. She wrote a prescription, a mild diuretic, nothing dramatic, but something they wanted to monitor. She recommended a follow-up in 2 weeks and some basic blood work. And then she wrote up the bill. $247. Which, in the grand scheme of American medical bills, was almost a bargain. But which, in the world of Kiara and her grandmother, was a mountain. That was how Kiara ended up at the counter. Counting. $7.53. She had lined the coins up in a small, neat row on the counter. 3 quarters, 2 dimes, a nickel, and 3 pennies. She had smoothed out the dollar bills the best she could, though one of them was so wrinkled it looked like it had been through a washing machine. She looked up at Brenda, the receptionist, and she said the thing she had been rehearsing on the bus. "Ma'am, I know it's not enough, but I promise I will bring the rest. I get $5 every week from Ms. Jefferson for helping with her groceries, and my grandma sometimes gets a check from the government at the beginning of the month, so maybe we can pay a little more then. Is that okay? Is it okay if we come back?" Brenda was not a cruel woman, but she was a tired one. She had been at the reception desk for 11 years. She had seen 1,000 versions of this scene. And she had a manager who reviewed her collections numbers every Friday and asked, always, "How many of these did you actually close out?" So Brenda opened her mouth to explain, gently, that the hospital had a payment plan option, but that it required a signed agreement and a co-signer and a valid ID, and before she could finish, a man's voice cut across the counter. "I'll take care of it." Brenda looked up. Kiara looked up. Even Mabel, who had been sitting quietly in the loaned wheelchair, looked up. The man in the charcoal suit had walked over. He was tall, taller than Kiara had realized from across the room. His hair was starting to go gray at the temples, and he was holding out a black credit card, held between two fingers like it was nothing at all. "The full amount," he said to Brenda. "And whatever the next appointment costs, and the blood work, just put it on the card." Kiara stared up at him. She did not know what to say. She had been raised, by Mabel and by her mother's memory and by the church 3 blocks away, to be polite, to say thank you, to never, ever take money from strangers. Grandma had told her that. Strangers were not to be trusted. Strangers who offered things wanted things. But this man in the fancy suit, he was not looking at her the way strangers usually looked at her. He was looking at her the way her grandmother sometimes looked at the photograph of her mother on the wall. Sad. But also, she thought, though she was only 6, proud. Which didn't make sense. Why would he be proud of her? He didn't even know her. Kiara found her voice. "Sir, thank you, but my grandma says we're not supposed to take money from strangers." The man in the suit crouched down. Right there, at the reception counter, in his expensive suit, he crouched down until his eyes were level with hers. And he said, in a voice that was very quiet and very serious, "I'm not giving money. I'm paying a bill. There's a difference." Kiara blinked. She thought about that for a moment. And then, because she was 6 years old, and because she had a very well-developed sense of fairness, she said, "But that's my grandma's bill. I'm supposed to pay it, because she takes care of me, and I take care of her. That's how it works." Oliver Kensington, the man who had, that morning, been negotiating a $40 million merger via text message, did not know what to say. Because in his entire life, he had never heard a more perfect definition of love than the one that had just come out of this 6-year-old's mouth. She takes care of me, and I take care of her. That's how it works. He swallowed. He was aware, dimly, that his own eyes were burning. He blinked, and he said, "Then how about this? I'll pay the bill today, and you can pay me back. $1 a week, as long as it takes. Deal?" Kiara considered this. She stuck out her small hand, very seriously, and she said, "Deal. But I get to shake on it, because that's how you make it a real deal." Oliver shook her hand. His hand swallowed hers completely. And then he stood up, gave Brenda the card, and turned to Mabel, who was watching him with the wary, curious eyes of a woman who had seen a lot of the world and knew that kindness always, always came with a price. "Ma'am," Oliver said to Mabel, and then, remembering himself, he pulled out his phone, opened a translation app, and typed, "Your granddaughter is remarkable. I would like to help if you will allow me." He turned the phone toward Mabel. Mabel read the screen. She read it twice, and then she looked up at Oliver, and she said, in slow but very clear English, "Sir, I do not need help. I have never needed help. I have Kiara, and she is enough." Oliver felt the sentence hit him like a physical blow, because Mabel was right. And Mabel was also, in a way that broke his heart, wrong. Kiara was enough. Kiara was more than enough. She was a miracle. She was a bridge. She was a translator. She was 6 years old. And she should not have had to be. Oliver did not go to his 11 o'clock merger call. He rescheduled it. His assistant David nearly had a heart attack, which, given Oliver's own cardiac history, was almost funny. Instead, Oliver went back to his office in a very quiet mood. He sat behind his big glass desk, in his big glass building, and he looked out over a city that suddenly felt like a stranger to him. He had lived in this city for 22 years. He thought he knew it, but he did not, he realized, know it at all. He knew the buildings on this side of the river. He knew the restaurants where the checks came with the wine list. He knew the airports and the boardrooms and the private clubs. He did not know Kiara's neighborhood. He did not know what it was to ride 2 buses to a hospital because you couldn't afford a cab. He did not know what it was to be 6 years old and count your family's savings out on a laminate counter under fluorescent lights. He called David in. David was 34 years old, extremely competent, and had learned, over 5 years of working for Oliver, when to speak and when to simply nod. He nodded now, as Oliver told him what had happened. He nodded when Oliver said he wanted to know more about the family. He nodded when Oliver said he wanted to know how many other children like Kiara were in that hospital's system. And when Oliver said, "I want to know about the mother, Amara. I want to know how she died," David simply pulled out his notebook and wrote down the name. It took David 3 days to come back with the file. The file was thin. That was the first thing Oliver noticed. It was thin because Amara's whole life had not left much of an administrative footprint, because that is how it goes for people who work 3 jobs and pay in cash and never really get to have a life on paper. But what was in the file? Oliver read it twice. Amara had been a registered nurse. She had worked at a nursing home in the north of the city. Before that, she had done home health care. Before that, she had gone to nursing school on scholarship, because she was, by every account, brilliant. She had graduated with honors. She had a daughter, Kiara, and a husband who had died of a heart attack when Kiara was 1. And then Amara herself had died a year later, of a treatable cardiac condition, because she had let her own health insurance lapse in order to keep the lights on for her daughter and mother-in-law. She had been 28. But that was not the part of the file that made Oliver put it down on his desk very slowly and stare at the ceiling for a long, long time. The part that did that was the second page, the record of Amara's employment. Oliver read the name of the nursing home, and then he read the name of the previous employer, which was a home health agency. And then he read the third entry, which was from 10 years earlier, a temporary position she had taken as an EMT. And there, on that entry, was a date. And on that date, Amara had been dispatched to the scene of a highway accident on Interstate 24. A single vehicle accident. Rollover. 1 occupant. Male. 41 years old. Oliver was that occupant. He had been 41, 10 years earlier. He had been driving home from a client dinner. He had been, if he was being honest, tired, and probably should not have been driving. He had fallen asleep for 1 second at the wheel. And he had woken up, upside down, in his own car, with the taste of blood in his mouth, and a young woman leaning through the shattered window telling him, in a soft voice, "Sir, I need you to stay with me. I need you to keep your eyes on me. You are going to be okay. I promise. I am not going to let you go." He had not caught her name that night. He had been in and out of consciousness. He had been airlifted to a trauma center. He had spent 3 weeks in a hospital and 6 months in physical therapy. And he had never forgotten the young woman with the steady voice who had held his hand in the ditch on Interstate 24 and refused to let him die. He had, twice over the following years, tried to find her. He had called the ambulance company. He had asked around. But the records had been vague, and the trail had gone cold. And eventually, life had gotten busy, and he had let it go. Her name was Amara. She had been 22 years old that night. She had saved his life. And 10 years later, in a country with a broken system, she had died because she could not save her own. Oliver did not cry very often. He was not that kind of man. But he cried that afternoon in his office, with the file open on his desk, and David standing very quietly in the doorway, pretending not to see. The next morning, Oliver called a meeting. He called it at his foundation. He had built the foundation 8 years earlier, mostly because his accountant had told him it was a good tax move, and mostly because his ex-wife had told him he needed to do something with his life that was not simply making more money. The foundation had a nice office on the 10th floor, and a nice logo on the door, and a nice mission statement that talked about empowering communities in language so vague it could have meant almost anything. For 8 years, the foundation had written checks. It had funded a scholarship here, a community center there, a gala once a year at which very wealthy people wore very expensive clothes and gave each other awards. It had been, Oliver realized now, a very polite form of doing nothing. That was going to change. He sat at the head of the conference table. There were 9 people in the room. His foundation director, his general counsel, David, and 6 program officers. He looked around at all of them, and he said, "I want to talk about interpreters." There was a small, confused pause, because Oliver did not usually start meetings this way. Oliver usually started meetings by asking about numbers. "There is a hospital," Oliver said. "St. Vincent's on the east side. It is legally required under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act and under Section 1557 of the Affordable Care Act to provide qualified medical interpreters to any patient who does not speak English. It is not doing that. It is instead handing clipboards to children. I want to know why, and then I want to fix it." The general counsel, a woman named Priya, who was extremely good at her job, leaned forward. "Oliver," she said carefully, "that's a systemic problem. It's happening at hundreds of hospitals. You're talking about a national issue." "I know," Oliver said. "So, you want to sue?" "No. I want to make it cheaper for them to do the right thing than to do the wrong thing. I want to fund it. I want to build the infrastructure. I want to hire the interpreters, train them, provide them to St. Vincent's for free for the first year, and then help them build it into their budget for year 2. I want to make it so that no child, do you understand, has to stand at a reception desk and translate her grandmother's illness. Not in this city. Not while I have money in the bank." The room was very quiet for a moment. Priya had a very small, very careful smile on her face, because Priya had been waiting 8 years for Oliver to say something like this. She had almost given up. "How much?" she asked. "Whatever it takes," Oliver said. "Start with 2 million. If we need more, we'll find more." The foundation director, a man named Marcus, cleared his throat. "Oliver, that's a significant reallocation. The board is going to want justification." Oliver looked at Marcus, and then he looked around the room, at everyone in it, and he said, "The justification is that 10 years ago, a 22-year-old woman named Amara pulled me out of a car on Interstate 24 and kept me alive until the helicopter came. 2 years later, her daughter was born. 6 years after that, that daughter, a 6-year-old child, was standing at a hospital reception counter counting $7.53 because our system was too broken and too lazy to give her grandmother an interpreter. I owe Amara my life. I did not know it. I know it now, and I intend to pay it back. Is that justification enough for the board? Marcus looked at his notepad. He looked at Priya. He looked at Oliver. And then, very slowly, he nodded. Yes. Yes, I believe it is. 2 weeks later, Oliver came back to the hospital. He did not come alone. He came with Priya and with the Foundation's newly hired program manager for language access, a woman named Yolande, who had been a medical interpreter herself for 15 years and who spoke 6 languages fluently. They had a meeting with the hospital's CEO, a nervous man in a tie who had received a very carefully worded letter from Priya 3 days earlier, and who had spent the intervening 72 hours reading the Civil Rights Act for the first time in his career. Oliver did not raise his voice in the meeting. He did not need to. He simply laid out what the Foundation was offering: fully funded interpreter services, on-site and via video, in the top 12 languages spoken in the hospital's patient population, for a full year, free of charge, with a mandatory transition plan for the hospital to take over the funding in year 2. And then he laid out the alternative: a federal complaint, filed by Priya, with the Office for Civil Rights at the Department of Health and Human Services, along with a very well-organized press release, along with a class action lawsuit that his foundation would be very happy to fund on behalf of every family the hospital had failed. The CEO chose the first option. He chose it very, very quickly. The program launched 6 weeks later. Yolande built it from the ground up. She hired 47 interpreters. She trained them, credentialed them, and stationed them across 3 shifts, 7 days a week. She installed video interpretation stations in every exam room and every emergency bay. She put up signs in 12 languages telling patients they had the right to a free interpreter. She trained the reception staff, including Brenda, who cried a little on the first day because Brenda had known for 11 years that something was wrong and had never quite known how to fix it. On the day the program launched, Oliver came back to the hospital one more time. He was carrying a small envelope. Inside the envelope was a check for $247 made out to Kiara. He walked into the lobby and he waited. He had asked David to reach out to Mrs. Alma Jefferson in apartment 3B and to ask if it might be possible for Kiara and her grandmother to come to the hospital that morning. Not for an appointment, just for a visit. Mrs. Jefferson had agreed. She had, in fact, put on her Sunday clothes for the occasion, and she had brought Kiara and Mabel herself in a borrowed car. They walked in through the revolving door. Kiara was in her pink sweater, though it was a little bigger on her now. Mrs. Jefferson had bought her a new one, and Mabel was walking, slowly but steadily, holding Kiara's hand. Behind the reception desk, a new sign had gone up. It said in 12 languages, "You have the right to a qualified interpreter, free of charge. Please ask any staff member." Kiara stopped in front of the sign. She read it. She read the English part first. Then, because she was Kiara, she read the Creole part out loud to her grandmother, translating as she went. And then she stopped and looked up at Oliver, who was standing a few feet away. "Mister," she said, "does this mean my grandma can talk to the doctor by herself now?" Oliver knelt down. "It means," he said, "that a grown-up will always be there to help her, so that you can just be a kid, which is what you should have been all along." Kiara thought about this, and then, with the very serious face of a small child considering a very grown-up thing, she said, "But I liked helping." Oliver's throat tightened. "I know, and you can still help. You can help by being a kid, by going to school, by doing your homework, by playing outside, by letting the grown-ups do the grown-up things. That's a way of helping too. Maybe the most important way. Kiara considered this some more, and then she said, "Okay, but I still want to shake your hand every time I see you, because we have a deal." "We have a deal," Oliver agreed. He handed her the envelope. She opened it. She looked at the check for a long moment, and then she looked at him, and then she said, with an expression that was somehow both very serious and very slightly mischievous, "Mister, this is way more than $1 a week." "It is," Oliver said. "Consider it back pay for all the weeks you were doing a grown-up's job." Kiara held the check very carefully. She said, "I'm going to give this to my grandma. She can buy new glasses. She's been needing new glasses for a long time. And maybe some real medicine. The kind that doesn't come from the pharmacy on the corner." "That sounds like a very good plan," Oliver said. The interpreter program grew. Within 6 months, it had served over 3,000 patients. Within a year, it had expanded to 2 more hospitals in the city, funded partly by Oliver's foundation and partly, because that is how things start to change, by the hospitals themselves, who had done the math and realized that patients who understood their diagnoses actually took their medications, actually came to their follow-ups, and actually cost the system less money in the long run, which is a very cynical way of saying that doing the right thing turned out to also be the smart thing, which is a thing that people in offices sometimes need to hear before they will do it. Yolande, the program manager, tracked the numbers. She counted the interpretations. She counted the patients. And she counted the children. The specific number of children under the age of 12 who had, in the year before the program launched, been recorded as acting as informal interpreter in the hospital's own intake notes. That number, she found, was 47. 47 Kiaras. In one hospital. In 1 year. Yolande put that number in the Foundation's annual report. She put it in bold. And underneath it, she wrote a single sentence, which Oliver himself had insisted on. "That's 47 Kiaras who don't have to stand at that counter anymore." The report went out. It was picked up by a local newspaper, then a regional one. Then a national health policy magazine did a long feature on the program, and the reporter, a woman named Elena, who had once been a child interpreter herself in her family's dry cleaning business, cried during the interview, though she asked Oliver not to put that part in the article, and he didn't. Other foundations reached out. 2 of them signed on to fund the expansion to other cities. A congresswoman from a neighboring district read the article and introduced a bill to strengthen federal enforcement of language access laws in federally funded hospitals. The bill did not pass, at first. Bills like that rarely pass at first. But it started a conversation, and the conversation kept going. Kiara, in the meantime, went to school. 1st grade, then 2nd. She was, unsurprisingly, an extremely good student. Her teacher wrote on her report card, "Kiara is remarkably mature and reads 2 grade levels above her age. She is a natural helper and has begun tutoring a classmate who is a new English learner." Which made Oliver laugh when he read it, because of course she was. Of course she was. Mabel got her new glasses, and better medicine, and, eventually, a small stipend from a foundation program that Oliver had, very quietly, set up in Amara's name. A scholarship fund for the children of first responders and healthcare workers who had died in service, whether or not that service had been recognized by any official ceremony. Amara had never been officially recognized. Oliver made sure her daughter would be. He did not make a big deal of it. He never posted about it on social media. He simply set up the fund, put Kiara at the top of the list, and made sure that when it was time for her to go to college, the money would be there. He did not tell Kiara about the fund. He told Mabel, and Mabel, who had by then learned to trust Oliver in her own slow and careful way, had looked at him across her small kitchen table and said, in her clearest English, "Mr. Kensington, my daughter saved you. She would be very proud that you are now saving her daughter." Oliver had said, "I'm not saving her. I'm just paying a bill." And Mabel had smiled, the first real smile Oliver had ever seen on her face, and she had said, "There is a difference, yes, but sometimes the difference is very small." A year after that first morning at the hospital, Kiara turned 7. There was a birthday party at Mrs. Jefferson's apartment on the 3rd floor. The apartment was small and warm, and it smelled like Haitian rice and beans and a chocolate cake Mrs. Jefferson had baked from scratch. There were 7 candles on the cake, and Kiara blew them all out in one breath, because she was a serious child who took birthday candle wishes very seriously and had been rehearsing her lung capacity all week. Oliver was there. He had been invited. He came in an ordinary sweater, not a suit, and he brought a small wrapped present, a book. A children's book about a little girl who becomes a doctor. He had asked a bookstore owner what the best book was for a smart 7-year-old girl who liked to help people, and this had been her recommendation. Kiara opened the present. She looked at the book. She looked at Oliver. And then she said, "Mister, I've been thinking. When I grow up, I want to be like my mama. I want to be a nurse, or maybe a doctor, because I already know how to translate, so I would be really good at it." Oliver looked at her. He looked at Mabel, who was in the corner of the room, sitting with Mrs. Jefferson, watching. He looked at the photograph on the wall, the same photograph that had hung on the wall of Kiara's apartment, the one of Amara in her nurse's uniform. Someone, probably Mabel, had brought it over for the party. He said, "Kiara, I think you would be the best doctor in the world." Kiara nodded, very matter-of-factly. "I know, because I care about people. That's the most important part. My grandma says that. She says being smart is nothing if you don't care. And I care a lot." "You do," Oliver said. "You care more than almost anyone I have ever met." Kiara looked at him for a long moment, and then she said, in the way that only a 7-year-old can say a true thing, "Mister, I think you care a lot too. You just forgot for a while, and then you remembered." Oliver did not answer right away, because he could not, because a 7-year-old had just told him, in 7 words, the entire truth of his own life. "You just forgot for a while, and then you remembered." He nodded. He said, "Yes, that's exactly what happened. That's exactly what you did for me." And Kiara, because she was 7, and because she had already had 2 pieces of chocolate cake, and because the world outside the window was full of possibilities, just grinned and said, "Cool. Can I have another piece of cake?" So this is a story about a child who carried the weight of a system that was supposed to carry her, and about a man who had forgotten how to see people, until a little girl with $7.53 made him remember. But mostly, and this is the part I want you to sit with, it is a story about the people all around us, every single day, who are doing jobs they should not have to do. The 6-year-old translating at the pharmacy. The 9-year-old filling out her father's tax forms. The 11-year-old calling the electric company to negotiate a payment plan for her mother. They are everywhere. And they are not on the news. And they are not in the reports. And they are not, for the most part, seen at all. They are seen only when someone stops, when someone puts down their phone, when someone looks up from their own life long enough to notice that across the room, a small person is carrying something far too heavy. You do not have to be a billionaire to do what Oliver Kensington did. You do not have to have a foundation, or a black credit card, or a corner office. You have to have eyes. You have to be willing to stop. You have to be willing to say, "I'll take care of it," even when it is small. A bag of groceries, a phone call, a form filled out, a moment of your time, a hand held out to a stranger who is not really a stranger, because none of us are really strangers, not when you get close enough to see. Kiara is in 5th grade now. She still wants to be a doctor. Her grandmother is doing well. Oliver Kensington still calls once a month just to check in. And in the lobby of St. Vincent's Hospital, there is a small plaque on the wall by the reception desk. It is easy to miss if you are not looking. It says only, "In memory of Amara, who saved a life on Interstate 24, and who taught us, 10 years later, that no child should have to stand alone at this counter." May we always ask. May we always help. May we always see. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that we still have the power to see each other. Subscribe for more true-hearted stories. And remember, the next Kiara might be standing right in front of you today. All you have to do is look up.